My boyfriend's brother's girlfriend tried to ruin our relationship. Now his family is falling apart. I never imagined that the person I'd need to keep my distance from in my boyfriend's family would be his brother's new girlfriend. I always thought that, no matter what happened, I'd always have a close connection with them all, a second family. But here I am, confused and on the verge of stepping away, just to keep the peace. But before I tell you how things fell apart, let me start from the beginning. My name is Lily, and I've been with my boyfriend Blake since we were both 17. We're 21 now, and over the past few years, we've built a relationship that feels like home. It's the kind of love that's steady, comforting, and filled with warmth. You know that feeling you get when everything just clicks? That's how we feel together. And it wasn't just our relationship that blossomed. Blake's family welcomed me with open arms, like I was one of their own. I spent every Easter, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and all the little events in between with them. His mom, Lisa, became someone I looked forward to seeing. Someone who, to my surprise, began to call me more than she called Blake. He loved to tease me about that. "Why is my mom more excited to talk to you than me?" he'd joke, but I think he secretly loved how well we got along. His father, Tom, treated me like his own daughter. He always reminded me that I wasn't just Blake's girlfriend. I was family. You know that sense of belonging, that feeling of being wanted and cherished? That's what I felt when I was with them. It was like I had gained more than just a boyfriend. I had gained another home. Then there was Blake's older brother, David. David was different. Not in a bad way, just quieter, more reserved. He kept to himself, didn't talk much, and wasn't as close with the family as Blake was. But that was fine. We got along well enough. We just didn't have the same bond I shared with the rest of his family. He was the kind of guy who always had a slight distance between him and the rest of the room, no matter how much he was physically present. Now, David had never really brought anyone home. In the 4 years I'd known him, he never had a girlfriend. So when Blake told me that David had finally started dating someone, I was happy for him. David deserved to be happy too, just like Blake and I were. He'd finally found someone who could maybe bring him out of his shell a little, and I was looking forward to meeting her. From what I knew, she was the same age as me, and I thought we might even become friends. That weekend was Blake's parents' anniversary, and as usual, they invited me over to celebrate with them. But this time, they had also invited David's new girlfriend. It would be the first time any of us met her, and I was genuinely excited. I mean, we're the same age, and she was dating David, so I figured we'd have a lot to talk about. I didn't expect things to go the way they did. I arrived at Blake's parents' place early that Saturday to help Lisa cook. That was something we loved doing together, preparing meals for the family. It always felt so cozy, so intimate. We'd talk about everything from recipes to random things we'd seen on TV, and it was our way of bonding. Blake and Tom were hanging out in the living room watching TV, and it was just a typical family gathering. But then David and his girlfriend arrived later in the evening. The moment she walked in, something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, or maybe it was just my nerves. I wanted everything to go smoothly. But then, as she introduced herself, things started to unravel. She greeted Blake and his father first, which was fine, but the way she did it, it was a little too much. She walked straight up to Blake, gave him a long, tight hug, and said, "I didn't know all the men in your family were this handsome." I watched Blake awkwardly pull back, a look of confusion on his face, and I couldn't help but feel a knot tightening in my stomach. Then, she did the same thing with his father, wrapping her arms around him and holding on just a bit too long. I saw Tom shift uncomfortably in his chair. It was one of those moments where you're not sure if you should laugh or be concerned, but it didn't stop there. When she finally moved on to Lisa, she gave her a quick, superficial compliment. "You're so pretty, Lisa. Watch out, though. Your husband's on my radar." She winked and laughed, but I noticed Lisa stiffen immediately. It wasn't the kind of compliment that made you feel good. It was the kind that made you wonder if something else was going on behind those words. And then, she didn't even acknowledge me. At that moment, I shrugged it off. Maybe she was just nervous or overwhelmed. Meeting a boyfriend's family for the first time can be stressful, right? I told myself not to read too much into it, but Lisa leaned over to me, her voice quiet, and whispered, "I have a bad feeling about her." I should have trusted that instinct. As the evening went on, things only got worse. The girlfriend, whose name was Clara, made herself very comfortable. Too comfortable. She sat on both Blake's and Tom's laps at different points, which left both of them looking completely uncomfortable. I caught Blake shooting me a glance that said everything. He wasn't okay with this, and neither was I. It wasn't long before Blake made his way into the kitchen, leaving Clara behind in the living room. "I don't like her," he said, his voice low but filled with irritation. I nodded, because honestly, I didn't like her either. Something about the way she carried herself made me uneasy. It wasn't just her over-familiarity with the men in the room. It was something deeper, something about the way she treated me. So I tried to engage her. I called Clara over to taste the pasta we were making. "We like spicy food, but I wasn't sure if you could handle it," I said, hoping to make small talk. She took a bite and smiled, but what she said next made my heart drop. "It's good. I see why they keep bringing you around." There it was, that backhanded compliment. It stung, even though she said it with a smile, and I realized in that moment that this wasn't just in my head. This was intentional. Clara didn't like me. She wanted me to know it. But still, I tried to keep things civil. After all, this was Blake's family, and I didn't want to make a scene. Then came dinner. Normally, we'd all gather around the table, say grace, and dig in. It was a tradition that I'd come to cherish. But this time, something was different. Blake's family invited Clara to say grace, since she was the guest. It was a sweet gesture, and I watched as she smiled, bowing her head and clasping her hands together. And then she began. She thanked God for the food, for Blake's family, for David, for everyone around the table. Except me. She didn't even mention my name. I sat there listening as she went on, and I felt the sting of being intentionally left out. I glanced at Blake, who caught my eye with that same look of disbelief. Lisa, too, gave me a glance that said, "You saw that, right?" It wasn't just in my head. But I brushed it off. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Maybe she'd just forgotten, or maybe she didn't know how important I was to Blake's family. I told myself not to overthink it, but as dinner went on, it became clear that this wasn't just a one-time slip. Blake's dad, Tom, started grilling Clara with questions about her life, her job, her background, her family. It was his way of getting to know her, and it was something he had done with me, too, when I first joined the family. Clara answered his questions, and from what I could gather, she came from a decent background. There wasn't anything particularly alarming about her responses. But then Tom turned to me, asking about my plans for graduate school. And before I could even open my mouth, Clara jumped in again. She interrupted me, launching into a monologue about her own work and how much she hated it. Tom's polite smile faded, and I could tell he wasn't really interested in what she was saying. He gave her a few short, dry responses, clearly trying to steer the conversation back to me. But every time I was acknowledged, every time Tom or Lisa asked me a question, Clara found a way to interrupt, to shift the focus back onto herself. It was exhausting. I couldn't even finish a sentence without her cutting me off. As the evening dragged on, Clara's behavior became more erratic. By the time dessert rolled around, she made a joke that left everyone at the table silent. "Be careful, David," she said, turning to her boyfriend. "I might just leave you for Blake." The room went still. I could see the tension in Blake's jaw as he forced a smile, clearly uncomfortable with the comment. But I wasn't going to let it get to me. I'd learned over the years not to let petty jealousy or insecurity bother me. So I smiled and said, "Yeah, Blake, remember to invite me to the wedding when it happens." I thought I'd handled it well, that we could all laugh it off and move on. But Clara's reaction was anything but lighthearted. Her face twisted, and suddenly she started crying, loudly. "She's been trying to embarrass me the entire night," she wailed, her voice cracking with emotion. Everyone stared at her, shocked. She wasn't just upset. She was furious, almost hysterical. Clara went on, accusing me of hogging Blake's family and making her look bad in front of them. It was surreal, watching her unravel like that. I didn't know what to say. I hadn't done anything to provoke her, and yet here she was, sobbing and accusing me of trying to make her look bad. Blake's family looked just as stunned as I felt. David quickly jumped up, trying to calm her down, but she wasn't having it. She grabbed his arm and stormed out of the house, dragging him with her. They had been invited to stay for the weekend, but they left without so much as a goodbye. I watched them go, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. After they left, Lisa sighed, turning to me with an apologetic look. "I'm so sorry you had to deal with that," she said. "I don't know what got into her." Blake's family reassured me that I hadn't done anything wrong, that Clara's behavior was out of line. We spent the rest of the night trying to unwind, having drinks and talking, but the evening had taken a strange turn. There was an underlying sense of discomfort, like we were all trying to figure out what had just happened. The next day, things only got more complicated. Lisa got a call from David, who seemed angry. Really angry. She put the phone on speaker, and we all listened as David's voice crackled through the line. His words were harsh, almost accusatory. "Clara's really upset," he said, his tone tense. "She's having doubts about our relationship, and it's because of her. It's because of Lily." I blinked in disbelief. What? What had I done to make her feel that way? I'd barely spoken to her, and now she was blaming me for her doubts about David? "She doesn't think things will work between us as long as Lily's involved with the family," David continued. "She feels threatened by her." I glanced at Blake, who looked just as bewildered as I felt. Threatened? By me? But it didn't stop there. David went on to say something that left the entire room in stunned silence. "She wants you to break up with Blake," David said, his voice cold. "She thinks it's the only way she'll feel secure in our relationship." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wanted me to break up with Blake? Just so she could feel better about her relationship with David? That wasn't just unreasonable. It was absurd. Blake immediately shut down the idea, as did his parents. There was no way they were going to let someone like Clara dictate the future of our relationship. But David wasn't backing down. "Either she's out of the family or I am," he said, his voice hard. "I don't want to end things with Clara over someone who's not even related to us in the first place." With that, David hung up, leaving us all sitting in stunned silence. And just like that, the family I had come to love, the family that had become a second home to me, was at risk of falling apart. Not because of anything I had done, but because of someone else's insecurity. I didn't know what to do. Should I walk away? Should I distance myself from Blake's family to keep the peace? The last thing I wanted was to be the reason for a rift between Blake and his brother, but I loved Blake, and I couldn't imagine leaving him. But before I could figure out what to do, Lisa managed to get David to come over, without Clara this time. We all sat down together, trying to work things out, but it wasn't long before the conversation turned heated. David apologized for the scene that had happened the night before, but he was still adamant that Blake and I should break up for the sake of his relationship with Clara. Blake was furious, and the two brothers went back and forth, arguing over what was best for the family, for their futures. I sat there, silent, not knowing what to say. This wasn't my fight, and yet it felt like I was at the center of it all. Finally, in a fit of frustration, David stood up and stormed out, but not before saying one last thing that left the room in a tense, uncomfortable silence. "You can shove that ring up your ass," he spat, glaring at Blake. "And don't even think about inviting me to the wedding." After he left, Blake turned to me, his face pale, and that's when he told me something I hadn't expected to hear. "I was going to propose," he said quietly. "Not now, but soon. I bought the ring months ago. I even told my family about it, including David." Everything started to make sense. The tension, the way David had been acting since we'd arrived that weekend. It wasn't just about Clara. It was about the fact that Blake was planning to marry me. And David? He couldn't handle it. Now, I don't know how things will turn out. Blake still plans to propose, but the fallout with David and Clara has left a heavy cloud over everything. I love Blake, and I want to be with him, but I don't want to be the reason his family falls apart. So for now, I'm keeping my distance from the family, giving everyone space to figure things out. I just hope, in the end, that love wins. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Stories Unfolded. Have you ever faced a situation like this? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more real life stories about family, relationships, and the challenges we face in life.